My name is Evelyn Shores, and I'm 31 years old. 2 weeks ago, my father slid a folder across his kitchen table and told me to open it. Inside was an invoice, a real one, printed on his old company letterhead. At the top it read, "Cost of raising an ungrateful child." The total was $180,000. He had itemized it. Every meal, every winter coat. My 8th birthday, $40. My braces. And in a second column, untouchable, my sister's entire wedding, marked with a single word, love. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I asked him to sign the bottom. He laughed until his eyes watered. Then he signed it, and then I turned it to the line he forgot. What my father didn't know, what he'd been too careful to imagine, was that I'd spent the last 2 months reading a set of books he was certain no one would ever open. And the number he'd written as a joke was about to become the most expensive signature of his life. Before I go any further, if your chest is already tight, if you already recognize this kind of father, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps this story find the people who need it. And drop your city and the time where you are in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel at night. I'm Evelyn. This is the story of a man who tried to bill his own daughter for being born, and what happened when he signed his name to the wrong line. To understand that invoice, you have to go back, all the way to the one person in our family who kept an honest ledger. We were not poor. That part matters because people hear father billed his daughter and they picture desperation. There was none. My father, Gerald Shores, sold commercial insurance for 30 years and did very well at it. We had the Colonial on Mountain Road in West Hartford, the country club membership he never used, the right pew at the right church on Sundays. What we did not have in that house was love split evenly. My mother died when I was 8. Ovarian cancer, fast and quiet, the way the worst ones are. After she was gone, the house reorganized itself around a single principle, and I was on the wrong side of it. There were 2 daughters, me and my sister Vanessa, 3 years younger. From the outside, we looked treated the same. New shoes for both, 2 stockings on the mantel. But a child knows. A child always knows. Vanessa got the benefit of every doubt. I got the invoice. I mean that almost literally, even back then. When Vanessa broke a lamp, it was an accident. When I broke a glass, my father would ask, "Do you have any idea what that costs?" He kept a running tally behind his eyes. What I was worth against what I cost him. I could feel the arithmetic happening whenever he looked at me. The one person who refused to do that math was my grandmother. Her name was Eleanor. My father's mother. She lived 20 minutes away in a small house with a green door and a garden she fought the deer for every summer. After Mom died, Eleanor became the place I went to feel like a whole person instead of a line item. She had been a bookkeeper for a hardware company most of her life. She thought in ledgers too. But hers were honest. "People show you their books, Evie," she told me once. I was maybe 11 at her kitchen table. Not the ones they hand you, the real ones. Watch where the money actually goes, and you'll know exactly who they love. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. There was one evening I think about more than I should. My father came to pick me up early. Vanessa had a recital. He stood in Eleanor's doorway, keys jingling, impatient. "Come on, Evie. Your sister needs us there." Not, "I'd like you there, your sister needs us." As if I were staff being summoned to the main event, Eleanor walked me to the door. She crouched to my level and she didn't whisper. She said it plainly, so her son could hear. "You are not the warm-up act for anybody in this family." Then she kissed my forehead and stood and looked at him, and neither of them said a word. In the car, my father told me his mother was getting soft in her old age. "Don't let her fill your head, Evie. The world doesn't owe you a spotlight." I was 10. I didn't have the words to argue. But even then, I noticed how he answered things no one had asked. Eleanor had never mentioned a spotlight. She'd only said I wasn't a warm-up act. My father was always rebutting an accusation that lived only inside his own head. I didn't know it yet, but Eleanor had already begun keeping a ledger with my name on it. A real one her son would never learn how to read. You learn early what your role is in a family like mine. Mine was the one who absorbed. When my father was angry, I absorbed it. When Vanessa needed something, I made do so she could have it. I told myself this was just what older sisters did. I told myself a great many things in that house. The birthdays were the clearest scoreboard. Vanessa's birthdays were productions. A bouncy castle one year, a pony the next. The whole class invited, the backyard strung with lights, my father behind the camera, beaming. He has hundreds of photos of Vanessa over candles. I have 4 photos of my own birthdays after my mother died. 3 of them are at Eleanor's kitchen table because that's where my birthdays happened. She'd bake a yellow cake with chocolate frosting and let me lick the bowl and pretend the singing took more than 2 voices. One year I asked for a party. I was 12, just a few friends. My father looked at me over his newspaper. "We'll see what it costs." It cost too much. For me, it always cost too much. That same spring, he took Vanessa to Disney for her 9th birthday. Just the 2 of them. He told me someone had to stay and watch the house. There was a Christmas I think about even more. My father had a tradition, envelopes before the presents. Vanessa's envelope that year held tickets to a Broadway show, a hotel night, the whole weekend. Mine held a folded sheet of paper, a spreadsheet, every dollar he'd spent on my upcoming braces, with a line at the bottom in his neat hand, to be appreciated. I said thank you. I'd learned to say thank you for the bill. Vanessa, to her credit, looked uncomfortable. She was 12, and even she could feel something in the room was wrong. But she was a child, and children take the seat they're given. She took the good one. I don't blame her for that. I blame the man who assigned the seats. The word he used most, my whole childhood, was grateful. It was the toll I paid for everything. A new coat, be grateful. A ride to practice, be grateful. He said it so often that for years I believed gratitude was a debt you carried, not a feeling you had. I'd lie awake doing the math of what I owed and never once feeling like I'd paid it down. That's what being raised on an invoice does. You grow up certain you're in arrears, and you never learn the figure because the person holding the ledger keeps it where you can't see. Eleanor never once told me to be grateful. She told me to be careful. Those are not the same word, and the distance between them is the whole story. When Vanessa turned 16, there was a used Honda in the driveway with a bow on the hood. When I turned 16, my father co-signed a loan in my name and reminded me every month for 3 years that he was doing me a favor a lot of fathers wouldn't. Why, I made every payment from a grocery store job. He told relatives he'd bought me a car. Technically true. He never mentioned the loan with my name on it, or that I paid it to the last dollar myself. I learned, young, the exact shape of his generosity. It was always something I'd be billed for later, always in a currency of guilt. I stayed with Eleanor most weekends by then. She never pried, but she watched. Once, after I let slip about the braces spreadsheet, she went very quiet. And then she wrote something in a small book she kept in a kitchen drawer. I thought it was a grocery list. I know now it wasn't. She was keeping count, not of dollars, of evidence. If you grew up like that, the scapegoat, the one loved on a spreadsheet while a sibling was loved out loud, tell me in the comments. I want to know I'm not the only one who learned the language of money before I learned to stop apologizing for taking up space. I left for college at 18, and I did not look back. I went to the University of Connecticut in state because my father made it very clear, with an actual printout, what each year would cost and which portion I was expected to be grateful for. Vanessa, 3 years later, went to a private school in Boston. I never saw a printout for that. I never saw a single number. I learned the tuition by accident from a comment at a Thanksgiving table. It was more than triple mine. I studied accounting. Of course I did. The first years out of that house were the loneliest and the freest I'd ever been. A studio apartment in Hartford with a radiator that knocked all winter and a view of a parking lot. I loved it. For the first time, no one handed me a printout of what my existence cost. I learned that a bill you choose is nothing at all like a bill someone hands you to prove you're a burden. I called Eleanor every Sunday. She was the only person who wanted to hear about depreciation schedules. She'd tell me about the deer and the garden, the war that never ended. Near the end, her voice started to thin on the phone, and she'd repeat herself, and I pretended not to notice because noticing felt like admitting she was leaving. By the time I was 24, I was at a firm in Hartford finishing the certification that would change everything: forensic accounting. Let me tell you what that is, because it matters. Most accountants tell you what the numbers are. Forensic accountants tell you what the numbers were before someone tried to change them. We get hired when a partner hides money in a divorce, when a treasurer skims, when a trustee has been borrowing. We follow the trail people are certain they've erased. I was good at it. I was good at it because I'd been doing it my whole life, just with feelings, instead of spreadsheets. I'd spent 18 years tracking the gap between what my father said and what he actually did. In the spring of my 24th year, my grandmother died. A stroke in her garden, with the deer fence half mended and her gloves still on. My father handled everything. The service, the house, the estate. He told me there was no need to involve me in the financial side. He said it gently, the way he said everything when he wanted a door closed. It's complicated, Evie. Let me protect you from the headache. I let him. That's the part I have to own. I was grieving the only person who'd ever made me feel chosen, and I didn't have it in me to read a single document, He was the executor. He had it handled. At the reception after her funeral, I overheard him talking to my uncle. He didn't know I was behind him by the coffee. There wasn't much, my father said. She left a little to the church, some to the girls. Honestly, by the end, she'd spent most of it. A little to the church, some to the girls. Most of it spent. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was the executor. He held the books. I drove home from that reception and pulled onto the highway shoulder because I couldn't see through my own crying. Not about money. I wasn't thinking about money at all. I was thinking the one person who'd crouched to my level and told me I wasn't a warm-up act was gone. That's the grief that lets a lie like most of it spent slip right past you. You're not auditing. You're surviving. The thing my father never imagined was that the girl he kept handing fake ledgers to had grown into a woman who read the real ones for a living. For 5 years, nothing happened, or rather, everything happened the way it always had, just quieter and at a more expensive scale. Vanessa got engaged. Then she got a house, a beautiful one in Avon, stone front, deep green yard. I assumed her fiancé's family had money. Then my father threw her an engagement party and began planning a wedding that the whole family described in hushed and reverent tones as what Gerald is doing for Vanessa. What Gerald is doing for Vanessa. I heard that sentence 100 times. I never once heard a single person ask what Gerald was doing it with. I didn't ask either. Not for a long time. Here is the piece my father forgot. The same kind of thing he'd forget on an invoice 2 weeks ago. My grandmother's trust had a clause. I'd learn the exact wording later, in a lawyer's office, but you need it now. She'd set money aside for me starting when I was a girl. She named my father trustee, but only temporarily. I was to receive the trust outright when I turned 30. I turned 30 last November. Nothing came, no letter, no call, no money. I assumed again that there was simply nothing to come. Most of it spent. His words did my thinking for me, the way they always had. But that birthday something itched. Eleanor's voice across 19 years. Watch where the money actually goes. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my days demanding documents people would rather I never see. And it struck me, standing in my own kitchen with a slice of grocery store cake, that in my entire adult life I had never once demanded my own. So in September, I did the most boring thing imaginable. I typed a certified letter to the bank that had held my grandmother's accounts. I identified myself as a named beneficiary of the Eleanor Shores Trust. I requested a full accounting from the date of her death. My hand hovered over the envelope before I sealed it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was digging for a wound that wasn't there, that I should let a dead woman and a difficult father rest. I mailed it anyway. Eleanor would have mailed it. 3 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived. I carried it inside, set it on my kitchen table, put on my reading glasses, uncapped a pen. And then I opened it and the floor of my life went quietly out from under me. Here is what the documents told me, in the cold language I'd been trained to read. The trust had not been small. My grandmother had funded it carefully across nearly 2 decades, a little at a time, a bookkeeper's patience. By the time she died, it held a little over $180,000. 180,000. Hold that number. You've heard it before. You'll hear it again. The accounting showed the trust intact on the day she died. Then, beginning about 6 months after the funeral, the withdrawals started. They were not reckless. That's the detail that told me it was him. They were careful, the work of a man who'd sold financial products for 30 years and knew exactly how a statement gets read. A wire here, a transfer there, each one labeled with something forgettable. Maintenance, distribution, administrative fee. That was the part that turned my stomach professionally. You only mislabel a thing when you know it's wrong. Each soft, boring word was a tiny confession. I'd seen the pattern a dozen times in embezzlement files. I'd just never seen it in my own family's handwriting. I worked it for 3 nights. I printed the statements and spread them across my living room floor, color coding by year, drawing lines from a withdrawal to where it landed. My apartment looked like a detective's corkboard. I kept a legal pad beside me and wrote each match in my own hand, because some part of me needed to see it in ink, the way Eleanor wrote things in ink before I'd let myself believe it. The first large transfer landed in the same month Vanessa closed on the house in Avon. I pulled the public record of the sale to confirm the date. It matched. The second cluster, a year later, lined up to the week with deposits to a wedding venue, a caterer, a bridal salon. I cross-checked the venue's name against the transfer memo. It matched. Every door I tried to talk myself out of opening swung onto the same room. There was a moment, around 2 a.m. on the third night, when I sat back on my heels, in the middle of all those pages, and tried genuinely to find the innocent version. That's the discipline of my job. You don't get to want an answer. You have to rule out the alternatives. Maybe he'd moved the money into a different account for me. I checked. There was no account for me. Maybe the timing with Vanessa's house was coincidence. I pulled 3 years of his own disclosed finances from the divorce grade habits I'd built and found he didn't have the liquid cash to cover either purchase on his own. The only way the numbers balanced was the way I didn't want them to. He'd needed the trust. He'd taken the trust. And he'd dressed each withdrawal in a word boring enough that no one would ask. My father had not paid for my sister's house with his own money. He had not paid for her wedding with his own savings. He had paid for both with mine, with Eleanor's gift to me, with the patient savings of a bookkeeper who once said, "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." And the total when I finished was almost unbearably neat. The amount drained from my trust sat right around $180,000, the exact figure my father would later print across the top of an invoice and hand me as a birthday joke. I did not cry. I'd love to tell you I felt rage, but the first thing I felt was clarity. Cold and complete, like stepping outside into a January morning with no coat. Every confusing thing about my childhood resolved into a single line of accounting. He hadn't simply loved me less. He had spent me. I sat on my living room floor, surrounded by the proof until the radiator went cold and the parking lot light came on outside my window. I thought about every "we'll see what it costs," every "be grateful," the braces spreadsheet in a Christmas envelope. For 23 years, I'd carried a vague, formless sense that I owed my family something I could never repay. And here it was, finally itemized. Except the debt ran the other way. The whole time I'd been apologizing for the cost of my existence, he'd been quietly liquidating the one thing that proved my existence was a gift. I didn't feel like crying. I felt like a person who has been squinting their whole life and is handed, at last, a pair of glasses. And I knew sitting there that the numbers alone would not be enough, not against him. I understood my father too well to think I could win with a folder of bank statements. If I walked into a family dinner with the accounting, he would not flinch. He would call me jealous, unstable, grieving, and confused. He would say I was slandering a dead woman's memory, and he'd say it so smoothly that even I might begin to doubt the pages in my own hands. I'd been doubting myself in that house since I was 8. More than that, he had a defense ready, and I knew exactly what it was, because I'd heard the seed of it at his mother's funeral. There was no trust like that. Most of it was spent. I was the executor. I'd know. He would simply deny the trust had ever held real money, deny he'd controlled it, and dare me to prove a negative against the man who'd held all the paperwork. So before I did anything else, I drove to West Hartford, to the small house with the green door, which my father had never sold. He kept it for storage, he always said. I still had a key. He had never once thought to ask for it back. That, in the end, is the man. Meticulous about money, careless about the daughter he assumed would never look. I spent a Saturday in my grandmother's dining room, working through the boxes shoved against the wall, tax folders, recipe cards in her slanted hand, a shoebox of photographs, every picture from every birthday she had ever made me. She'd saved them all. He'd boxed them like clutter and stacked something heavy on top. The kitchen drawer where she kept her grocery list book was empty. I remember the specific disappointment of that. And then I remembered what she'd taught me. Not the books they hand you, the real ones. She was too careful to leave the real one somewhere obvious. So I stopped looking where things belonged and started looking where things hide. At the bottom of a hat box, wrapped in a folded grocery bag, I found her ledgers, not the bank's, hers, the real ones. A handwritten record of the trust from the day she opened it, every deposit, every date, the slow, deliberate build of it across 19 years, and in the margin beside the final entry, in her careful blue ink for Evelyn, hers alone, G to hold only, G to hold only, Gerald to hold only. I had to sit down on the dusty floor and breathe. She had known, maybe not that he'd steal it outright, but she'd known her own son well enough to write, in permanent ink, that he was a holder and not an owner. She'd built a witness against him before he ever gave her a reason to need one. On Monday, I called an estate attorney. His name was Mr. Holloway, and I promise I did not engineer this. He turned out to be the very lawyer who had drafted my grandmother's trust 19 years earlier. He remembered her. "Sharp woman," he said, almost smiling. Insisted on the language herself. Wouldn't let me soften a single word. I laid everything across his desk. The accounting, the ledgers, the blue ink margin. He read a long time, Then he took off his glasses, the way I take off mine when a number has changed everything, and he told me where I stood. The good news: what my father did was a breach of fiduciary duty, using trust assets for his own purposes, recoverable possibly with penalties. With the trust document and the bank trail, the case was strong. The bad news was the gap I already feared. Men like your father, Holloway said, are very good at being the executor with no records and the trustee with no paperwork. He kept it verbal on purpose, probably without even thinking of it as a crime. In his mind, the money was the family's, and he was the family. He tapped the ledger. If he simply denies the trust ever held this money, denies he controlled it, we can still likely win. But he'll drag it through a courtroom. He'll attack your grandmother's competence. He'll attack you. And he'll be comfortable the whole time because he's never put one careless word in writing in his life. I asked what would close that gap. Something in his own hand, Holloway said, that we can hang the denial on. He won't admit he's a trustee. He's too careful for that. But if he ever puts his signature under a financial statement we can prove is false or incomplete, his own credibility does the work. We don't need him to confess. We need him to lie in writing about something we can disprove. After that, every denial he makes in court is just another contradiction. I asked how I was supposed to get a careful man to sign a false financial statement. Holloway smiled, dry. You don't ask a careful man to confess. You give him something he badly wants to sign. He leaned forward. Here's the psychology of it, and I've watched it for 40 years. A man like your father has spent his whole life avoiding the wrong signature. But that caution is technical, not moral. It lives in the part of his brain that reads contracts. The part of him that wants to win over you, that's a different room entirely, and it doesn't read the fine print. If you make him feel he's finally beaten you, the careful man steps aside and lets the proud one hold the pen. He sat back. You won't trick him with legal language. He'll smell it. You'll do it with his own. Make the statement sound like your surrender, not his admission. Make him want to frame it on the wall. He drafted nothing for me to carry. That was deliberate, too. If I hand you a typed clause, he said, it looks like a lawyer wrote it, and he'll feel the trap. You write it, by hand, in plain words. It should look like a frustrated daughter trying to end a fight, not like evidence. He told me what the statement needed to accomplish. A sworn completeness that this was all of it, nothing left out. And he made me say it back to him 3 times in my own phrasing until it stopped sounding like law and started sounding like family. I drove home turning that over. And by the time I reached my apartment, I knew exactly what my father wanted more than anything in the world. He wanted me to admit I was a debt. He'd wanted it for 31 years. So I would let him give me the very thing I needed. I'd just make sure. He wrote it down first. What do you think a man like that believed he was winning when he finally got his ungrateful daughter to sit down and sign? Hold that thought. I want you to remember it when you see what he actually put his name to. 2 days later, my father called. He said, something he'd been meaning to give me for years. He met me at the door in his good cardigan, the one he wore when he was pleased with himself. Vanessa was there too, curled on the sofa, scrolling her phone, half present the way she usually was. Hold that detail. She heard the beginning of this. She did not hear the end. He made coffee. He was, for him, almost warm. That put me more on edge than coldness ever had. Warmth from my father was usually wrapping paper on something with an edge. "Sit," he said. "I've been thinking about your birthday. The big 3-1. He smiled like he was handing me a kindness. "I made you something." He slid the folder across the kitchen table. I opened it. Cost of raising an ungrateful child. The total in bold. $180,000. The meals, the coats, the braces. Birthday, age 8, $40. And in the second column, golden and untouchable, my sister's entire wedding under one word: love. "It's a joke," he said, watching for the flinch. "Mostly, but you should know what you cost. People your age have no idea." He chuckled into his coffee. "Your sister appreciates what she's given. You've always carried yourself like the world owed you something." Vanessa glanced up, gave a thin, uncomfortable laugh, and went back to her phone. Here is the moment I'm most proud of. I felt the old reflex rise, to defend, to plead, to shrink small enough to be forgiven. The 31-year-old absorber reporting for duty. And for the first time in my life, I let it pass straight through me, like weather across a field. I didn't argue. I smiled. And I gave him the thing he'd wanted for 3 decades. "You're right," I said. "I've cost this family. I'm tired of fighting about it." I let my voice go quiet, almost ashamed. "Let's just settle it once, so I never have to hear the number again." His eyes changed. I watched 31 years of wanting fill them up. "I mean it," I said. "Let's make it final. You write what I owe, I acknowledge it, and we close the books. No more invoices, no more Christmas spreadsheets. Done." "That," my father said slowly, "is the most grown-up thing you've ever said." I want to be honest about what was happening inside me while I said those words. My pulse was going so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Part of me was screaming that this was monstrous, that a daughter shouldn't have to engineer her own father into a confession to get back what a dead woman left her. And part of me, the older and colder part, the part Eleanor had trained at a kitchen table with a paper roll calculator, was simply watching his face for the exact moment. His pride overruled his caution. It came when I said grown up. I watched the word land. I watched him decide he'd finally raised me right. I took a pen from my bag. Not his good one, mine. I wrote 2 lines by hand at the bottom of his invoice, beneath the total, in the plain, blunt language Holloway had coached me to use. Not legal language. His language. The language of a man closing a deal in his own favor. The undersigned confirms this document represents the complete and accurate accounting of all financial matters and obligations between Gerald Shores and Evelyn Shores. Nothing omitted, nothing owed outside it. And under that, a line for each of us. "What's this?" he said, not suspicious, pleased. He thought I was formalizing my own surrender. "It's me admitting it's settled," I said, "complete and accurate, so I can't come back in 5 years and say you owe me anything." I slid it toward him. "You first, then me. Father to daughter." Oh, he loved that. He thought he'd finally won. thought he'd at last gotten the ungrateful daughter to sign away every grievance she'd ever held. He took his good pen from his shirt pocket, the heavy one he signed insurance policies with, and he signed beneath that line with a flourish, laughing the entire time. He did not read it twice. Why would he? It said what he'd always believed, complete and accurate, nothing owed outside it. To him, it was a victory lap in writing. He'd just signed his name beneath a sworn statement that there were no financial matters between us, except the ones on that page. And the one thing not on that page, the one thing his complete and accurate accounting left out entirely, was $180,000 of his mother's money that belonged to me. I did not sign my line. I closed the folder before he could look at it twice and slipped it into my bag. I thanked him for the coffee. "You'll get this back," I told him, standing. "At Vanessa's engagement party." He smiled, certain I meant some sweet family moment. He was still smiling when I left with the folder under my arm and his signature drying inside it. I drove straight to Holloway's office, even though it was nearly closing. I set the folder on his desk, open to the page. He read the invoice. He read the 2 handwritten lines above my father's signature. He read them again. Then he looked up with an expression I had not seen on him before. "He signed this, the completeness statement. He signed it laughing," I said. "He thought he was winning." Holloway sat back slowly. "Miss Shores, do you understand what he just did to himself?" I told him I did. I'd understood it the second the pen left the paper. "He's locked his own door," Holloway said. "He swears in his own hand that this is the complete and accurate accounting of everything financial between you. Nothing omitted. Now, when we produce the trust your grandmother left you and the bank records showing he drained it, he has exactly 2 roads, and both are cliffs. Either his sworn statement is false, which destroys his credibility on everything else he'll ever claim, or it's true, in which case he's just confirmed he had no right to keep that money from you, because there were no other obligations to offset it." He shook his head. "He didn't confess to being a trustee. He did something better. He swore there was nothing to find right before we find it. Connecticut lets you record a conversation if one party consents. And I'd had my phone recording in my pocket the whole time at that kitchen table. His voice telling me what I cost, his laugh, the scratch of the pen. We had the document, and we had the moment. Then came the 2 weeks. I want to tell you they were calm. They weren't. I barely slept. I'd lie awake running the scene. Not the legal one, the human one. My father's face, Vanessa's face, all those church people and golf friends. Twice I nearly called it off. Once I actually drafted a text to Holloway. "Let's just do the demand letter, keep it private, spare everyone." My thumb hovered over send. Then I'd look at the 4 framed photos I'd started arranging on my kitchen counter. Me at Eleanor's table year after year, 2 voices singing. And I'd put the phone down. He'd kept the score in public for 40 years, every dinner, every party, the braces spreadsheet in a Christmas envelope. He'd handed me that invoice with Vanessa 6 feet away on purpose because shaming me quietly would never have scratched the itch. The itch needed an audience. So would the answer. If you've ever sat at a table where the math of love never once came out in your favor and chosen finally to stop apologizing for it, Tell me below. I promise you, I see you. The engagement party was at a steakhouse downtown. A private back room, a long table dressed in white, roughly 45 people. Vanessa's fiancé's family, cousins, my father's golf friends, the church crowd, everyone whose opinion he had spent 4 decades carefully purchasing, gathered in one room to celebrate once again what Gerald was doing for Vanessa. I almost didn't go. I sat in my car in the lot a long time. I watched the guests go in, the church people in their good coats, the golf friends laughing, Vanessa's fiancé holding the door for his parents. Through the front window, I could see the warm light, the long white table, everyone walking into a celebration. None of them knew they were walking into something else. My hands were cold on the wheel. I checked the folder in my bag for the 3rd time, the way you check for keys you already know are there. I thought about leaving, right up to the last second. Then I thought about Eleanor at her own door, crouching down so her son could hear. You are not the warm-up act for anybody in this family. She'd never once handled the truth in a whisper. I got out of the car. My father spotted me in the doorway and raised his glass, expansive, the host of the year. Evelyn, she made it. A few people clapped. He leaned to the man beside him and said, just loud enough to carry, my older one, bit of a sourpuss. But she shows up. A bit of a sourpuss. His last free shot, I let him have it. Then he tapped a fork against his glass to begin a toast. And I asked, before he could start, whether I might say something first. As his daughter. About family. He could not say no. Not in that room, not in front of those people. That was the entire point of choosing that room. He swept his arm out, gracious, certain. The floor is yours, sweetheart. It was the last generous thing my father would ever do for me, and he had no idea he was doing it. I stood. I took the folder from under my arm. I kept my voice the way my grandmother kept her ledgers, calm, even, exact. 2 weeks ago, I said, my father gave me a birthday gift. I'd like to share it because it says something true about this family. I held up the invoice so the table could read the heading. Cost of raising an ungrateful child. A nervous ripple of laughter moved through the room. People assumed it was a roast. My father chuckled and settled back, relaxing. He thought I was about to make him look charmingly blunt. He enjoys looking charmingly blunt. It's the cover he hides the rest underneath. He calculated exactly what I cost him, down to the braces, down to a $40 birthday, $180,000. I let it sit. And in the same document, he marked my sister's entire wedding with a single word: love. The laughter thinned. Across the table, Vanessa had stopped smiling. You have to understand what that room was. Those were the people my father had performed for his whole life, the men he golfed with, the couples he sat near at church, the relatives who repeated what Gerald is doing for Vanessa like a prayer. He had never let any of them see the ledger he kept on me. He'd only shown them the generous host, the family man. I was about to show them the other set of books, the real ones. The lie came first, the way it always does. He spread his hands to the room, easy and warm. It's a joke, folks. Evelyn's never had a sense of humor about herself. Kids today, everything's a grievance. 2 golf friends chuckled, but quieter now. So I introduced the first evidence. It's a strange coincidence, that number, 180,000, because that is almost exactly what was in the trust my grandmother, his own mother, left to me. A trust I was to receive when I turned 30, which I turned last November, and which I've never seen a cent of. I set one bank page on the white tablecloth. This is the trust on the day she died, fully funded, intact. The room went quiet in a different way. My father's smile held, but his eyes ran the arithmetic I'd watched him run my whole life. Then he denied it, exactly as I knew he would. There was no trust like that. Smooth, but faster now. My mother left very little. I was the executor, I'd know. Evelyn's confused. She's always been overly emotional about her grandmother, so I gave them the stronger evidence. I laid the pages down one at a time, narrating each in the flat voice I use in depositions. 6 months after the funeral, a wire out of the trust. Here, into your account. Here, the same month Vanessa closed on the house in Avon. Next page. A year later, 3 transfers, a wedding venue, a caterer, a bridal salon. Next page. Every dollar that left this trust, I followed all of it. This is what I do for a living. I kept my voice low. The quieter you read a damning number, the louder it lands. This withdrawal is labeled maintenance. There was no property to maintain. This one says administrative fee. There was no administration. You named them carefully, Dad. A man managing a trust honestly doesn't disguise the line items. Only a man hiding something does. His golf friends weren't chuckling anymore. The fiancé's mother had a hand over her mouth. His voice cracked into something uglier under the smoothness. You broke into my mother's house. You stole private papers. This is harassment. A jealous, sick girl trying to ruin her sister's night. He looked down the table for allies. She's not well. She never has been. I didn't raise my voice to meet his. I'd learned long ago that in a room like this, the person who stays quietest wins. I let his accusation hang in the air a moment, let everyone hear how it sounded. A man calling his daughter sick instead of answering a single number. Then I reached for the trust document my grandmother's own attorney had drafted, and I laid it beside the bank pages. This is the trust itself, drafted 19 years ago by Mr. Holloway, who was happy to confirm every word of it. My grandmother's instructions in her language. The money was to be held for me and given to me at 30. And here, in her handwriting in the margin, I set down the photograph of the ledger page. For Evelyn, hers alone, G to hold only. Your mother wrote that, Dad. She knew exactly what you were. She just hoped she was wrong. Then came the final reveal. I drew the folder open on the table. You'll say I forged the bank records. You'll say my grandmother was confused. You'll say anything. I turned to the invoice and the 2 handwritten lines above his signature. So let's use your own words instead. 2 weeks ago, you handed me this, and I asked you to make it final, to settle everything between us once in writing. Do you remember what you signed? I read it aloud, slowly, every word, into the silence. The undersigned confirms this document represents the complete and accurate accounting of all financial matters and obligations between Gerald Shores and Evelyn Shores. Nothing omitted, nothing owed outside it. You signed that, I said, laughing, with your good pen, in front of your daughter. You swore in your own hand that this invoice was the complete and accurate accounting of everything financial between us. I held it up beside the trust page. So, here's the only question left in this room. Either your sworn statement is a lie, because it leaves out $180,000 of your mother's money that belonged to me, or it's the truth, and you've just confirmed you had no right to keep a cent of it from me. I set it down. There's no third answer, Dad. You closed every other door yourself. You signed it shut. Then came the silence. I've never heard a room go so completely still. 45 people and not one fork moved. My father's mouth opened, and nothing came out. For the first time in the 31 years I'd known him, the man had no number to throw, no smooth phrase to reach for, no joke to pull over the top of it. I watched it move through the room in real time. The fiancé's mother set her wine glass down very carefully. A cousin pressed her napkin to her mouth and began quietly to cry. The church friend who read the lessons on Sundays turned his whole body away from the head of the table. People weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at him and then looking away, which is the worst thing a room can do to a man who lives for an audience. And then he lost control. He shot up so hard his chair tipped and cracked against the floor. The whole table flinched. "That money was mine," he shouted. "She left it to this family, not to one ungrateful. I raised you. I fed you. You owe me." And there it was, in front of every person whose respect he'd spent a lifetime buying. Not "there's been a misunderstanding." Not "let's discuss this privately." He stood and shouted that money was mine, about a trust he had 2 weeks earlier, signed a sworn statement insisting did not exist. His own greed and his own pride hanged him in a single sentence, exactly the way Holloway had quietly predicted. I never had to land the blow. He swung the rope around his own neck and jumped. Across the table, Vanessa stood up slowly. She was crying, and she was not looking at me. She was looking at our father. "You told me you saved for years," she said, shaking. "You told me the house was your gift. The wedding was your gift to me." It broke apart in her throat. It was hers. All of it was Evelyn's. He had no answer for his golden child either. The arithmetic had finally run out. The consequences began right there before anyone had left the room. His oldest golf partner, a man named Tom, set down his napkin, leaned over, and said quietly, "Gerald, sit down and stop talking." The church people studied their laps. The fiancé's father pushed his chair back from the table, putting distance between his family and mine, and murmured something to his son I couldn't hear and didn't need to. My father stood in the wreckage of his own toast, gripping the back of his fallen chair. He looked, for the first time in my life, old. Not powerful, not frightening. An aging man who had built a kingdom out of other people's deference and watched it empty in the time it takes to read one paragraph aloud. He looked at me. I think he expected to find gloating. He didn't. I wasn't enjoying it. I was just done. I gathered my pages back into the folder. My hands were perfectly steady. I felt my grandmother at my shoulder one last time, and I believe, I truly do, that was the moment she was finally able to set down her pen. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping the truth, and chosen the truth even though It cost you the table. I want to hear from you. Tell me what it cost and what it gave back." The legal part was almost boring after that. The drama happens at the table. The justice happens in quiet offices, in plain folders, in signatures that don't laugh. With his sworn completeness statement, the bank's full accounting, and my grandmother's 19 years of handwritten ledgers, Holloway didn't need a trial. No defense wants a court examining a paper trail that clean against a man who swore in his own hand there was nothing to find. There was a settlement 3 months later in a conference room with no audience at all. My father came with his own lawyer, a younger man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. My father didn't look at me once across that table. He'd gotten very good, very fast, at reading every line before he signed it. A little late for that. He returned the principal, the full $180,000, plus a surcharge the court adds when a trustee spends trust money on himself. To do it, he had to refinance the very house he'd kept for storage, the house with the green door. He had to borrow against my grandmother's home to repay what he'd taken from her granddaughter. There is a kind of justice that writes its own poetry, and you don't need to add a word. The number I received was larger than the one he'd printed across the top of my invoice. The math, in the end, came out in my favor. It only took 20 years, a forensic accounting license, and a dead woman's foresight to balance the books. I didn't keep all of it. I gave a portion to the church my grandmother loved, in her name, the part she'd actually wanted to go there, before her son rewrote her wishes into most of it spent. The rest is in an account now with my name on it. Only my name. The way she always meant. My father and I do not speak. I'll be honest, because honesty is the only thing I owe this story. It isn't a triumphant silence, it's just silence. He sent one letter through a lawyer, calling me vindictive and unstable and a destroyer of families. I read it once. I didn't answer. There is nothing to recover in that direction, and I've finally stopped trying to balance a book the other party refuses to open. People ask if I feel guilty for doing it publicly. I've thought about it honestly. I don't. I gave him 40 years of privacy, and he used every one of them to keep score where it would hurt most. I set one boundary, once in the same currency he'd always paid me in. That isn't cruelty. That's an invoice finally coming due. Vanessa is a different story. She called a week after the party, sobbing, undone. She truly hadn't known. I watched her face come apart in real time at that table, and you can't fake that. She offered to give back whatever she could. I told her no. None of it was ever her debt. She was a child loved loudly, while I was a child priced quietly. And that was his doing, not hers. She came to my apartment that weekend. She saw the 4 framed photos on the wall before she said anything, and she stood in front of them a long time. "I don't have any of these," she finally said. "I have 100 birthday parties, and I can't remember one of them feeling like this." Then she asked, very quietly, whether Eleanor had ever said anything about her. I told her the truth, that our grandmother loved us both, but had only ever worried about one of us, and it wasn't the one everyone clapped for. Vanessa cried again at that, differently. The way you cry when something finally makes sense. We're building something now, slowly, carefully. with honest books between us and no one keeping a tally in the margins. The photographs Eleanor saved, every birthday at her kitchen table. I had them framed. They hang on my wall, 4 years old, 8, 12, grinning over a yellow cake with chocolate frosting. 2 voices singing and pretending it was a crowd. I look at them, and I don't see a child who cost $180,000. I see a child somebody chose, quietly, in ink, in a ledger she kept for 19 years, so that one day her granddaughter would have the strength to turn the page. My father wrote me an invoice for being raised and made me sign that it was complete. He just forgot to read the one line that proved it never could be. My grandmother left me the receipt for being loved. I know which one I keep on my wall.